it's a big honor to be here talking to you because, as a union, what you all are doing is getting organized in building power, in building solidarity. And so I want to speak to you today with both my writer, sort of philosopher, analyst hat, but also my organizer in the trenches hat, which is honestly the one I wear more often. So I am a co-founder of something called the Debt Collective, which, as the previous slide said, is we call it an experimental union of debtors. So inspired by the labor movement, inspired by tenants unions, our view is that debtors need to come together to exercise collective power and to fight for democratization of the economy, essentially. And we are most known for our work on student debt, which I'll talk about. The seeds of the Debt Collective were really planted, well, actually long ago. I'm going to do some history, but for me personally, in the 2008 financial crisis, when soon after which I defaulted on my student loans. I'm Canadian. I live in the United States, and then I joined the Occupy Wall Street movement. So it was in that moment of crisis. It was also a moment of intense learning. And I'm thinking a lot. And one thing I'd like to talk about with you all today, I've heard the Q&A can be quite lively, is how we prepare one thing I want to talk about is how we will prepare for coming economic crises and respond to them. So so these two sort of modes, the thinking, the writing, and the doing. One thing I really resist is the idea that theory and practice are separate things. So for me, I feel like organizing, trying to build collective power, has been one of the biggest sources of learning in my life. And a lot of the lessons that I've learned as an organizer, a lot of the things that have challenged my assumptions, make their way into my books. And so today, my remarks will draw on sort of two books. So one is The Age of Insecurity, which was mentioned, and the other one is slightly more recent, and it is called Solidarity. And I just wanted to show the cover because it is, a variation of the classic image of, people coming together in a mass in order to have more power than they would have alone. And these books were written at the same time, and they're, in my mind, they're sisters. They're sort of very much related to each other. And I think, one of the points I make in The Age of Insecurity, but I don't get to flesh it out as much, is that insecurity can be a catalyst for different responses. It can catalyze a kind of individualist, competitive, fearful response, the kind of insecurity that makes us think, I've got to get mine, maybe I need a bunker to survive climate change, maybe I need to, outcompete everybody and get really rich. Or it can it can foster a kind of collaborative response. And we can take that insecurity and, through organizing, turn it into solidarity. And so, that's just to kind of get at how they're related. But maybe to begin, I'll just say a little bit about that core argument, the core argument at the heart of The Age of Insecurity, which is a book in which I write a bit about the farm debt crisis in Canada. So as I said, I was sort of radicalized by the 2008 financial crisis, the Occupy Wall Street movement. And when people talk about the Occupy Wall Street movement, they always say that it changed the conversation. Sadly, we did not win the political battle, but I think it's fair to say that Occupy had a large resonance. And what it did was it put inequality, at least on the American agenda, because in the United States, there was such a deep aversion to talking about things like class, to saying the word capitalism, to being honest about the structure of the American economy. So suddenly we could talk about the fact that our politicians were bought and sold, and this was, it opened up a huge space. in the public debate. And so talking about inequality was important, right? And of course, Occupy popularized the conception of the 99% and the 1%. It opened up a space to talk about billionaires. And I think we can say today that we were absolutely right that billionaires are very, very dangerous and most definitely a threat to democracy, that concentrated wealth can buy concentrated power. And this is antithetical to the idea of a political system that is based on power sharing. So inequality is really important, but ultimately inequality is a snapshot of an economic relationship frozen in time. The 1% has this much wealth, the 99% has this much. Perhaps we could break it down even further. You know, the bottom quintile of the income bracket is this poor in relationship. And so it's a bit of a static thing. And so with the age of insecurity, I wanted to add a different dimension to that picture. I want to say we have to think about inequality, but actually we need to think about insecurity as well, which is, I like to say, it's sort of how the points on the graph feel. Because we're human beings who live in time. I might have enough today to pay my rent, but that doesn't mean I have enough that I feel secure, right? That doesn't mean that I know what my livelihood is going to be like 6 months from now, a year from now, a decade from now. You know, I don't know that I'm going to be able to have, you know, a dignified old age and a retirement, for example. And that provokes that sense of the future, provokes insecurity. And so my sense, you know, and this is again rooted in organizing, is that we actually have to really pay attention to this emotional dimension of economics. If we want to build solidarity, we can't just talk numbers. We can't just talk on the quantitative level. We have to be qualitative. We have to say, you know, how are you feeling in your economic life? Financial questions always have a kind of feelings dimension. Now, you know, I'm not saying we overcorrect to that side of the ledger. And I think there's also a way in which the lens of insecurity can help us create that solidarity. Why? Because inequality encourages us, again, I like to talk about inequality, it's important, but encourages us to look up and down at the extreme and obscene differentials of wealth and power, which is critical. But insecurity can help us look sideways and to say, you might have a bit more than me, I might have a bit more than you, but we are still, we have something, we have maybe more in common than we might otherwise see. And so in those lectures, I talk about the way that insecurity is actually kind of essential to the functioning of our economic and political system. So I distinguish between what I call existential insecurity, which is the fact that, you know, we're all vulnerable, we're all mortal, we all need care. So yes, there's some degree, and there's a way in which being anxious or insecure is innate to being human. But then there's what I call manufactured insecurity. And this is the kind of insecurity that is produced by a lack of, you know, job protections, right? By the fact that so many people have to go into debt to meet their basic needs, particularly, but not only in the United States. You know, the fact that the housing market, you know, is structured in a way that causes so many people to be sort of tenuous tenants, as opposed to people who feel like they have, as opposed to, for example, a situation like in Vienna where there's social housing and renters, you can be a renter and feel like, oh, I know I'm going to be able to stay in my apartment for many years to come. So this insecurity is manufactured. And so, you know, debt, of course, because I'm organizing around debt, became a big theme of both books. So that I want to talk about, I always want to talk about the importance of building solidarity as a means to building power. And so my point here is that this element of, again, the emotional aspects of our economic lives is really crucial. And I would not have known that if I had not been organizing. Because when you are trying to organize, which for me is the act of bringing disparate people into a formation where they can act as a block to exercise political and economic power, what you realize is you got to connect with folks, right? It's not you don't organize just by giving people an argument. You often have to tap into a different level. And when you're trying to organize people who are poor, or you are organizing people who are precariously employed, or you're organizing people who are in debt, there's often a lot of shame. People are shamed for being poor. People are shamed for struggling. And so being able to, what I quickly learned as we were trying to organize debtors at Occupy, and as we started building the debt collective, is that we actually had to both say, oh gosh, here's how compound interest works, and here's how much money they're making off your loans. But also, and guess what? It's not your fault. You don't have to feel bad about this, and you don't have to go hide. You can come out of the shadows, and we can work together to change this. Because do you know what? A couple generations ago, college was free or close to it. And there's a reason that that's changed. It's changed because it has been privatized, because there has been a conservative counter-revolution that has attacked public goods in this country. And so it was from that experience of organizing that I sort of developed this critique. So part of the exercise I wanted to do, I guess before I go into sort of what I learned a little bit about the situation with farmers and some thoughts about solidarity, I actually just wanted to share an animation I made. So if I had had my druthers, I've been in emergency organizing meetings, like feels like for weeks on end. So, I wish I had sort of visuals and photos to show you who makes up a debtors union, because it's all kinds of people. But I want to share with you now a sort of piece of propaganda I made. As I said, I think as it said in my bio, I occasionally make films. So sometimes I use my filmmaking for the movement. And it's an attempt to give a kind of overview of some of our analysis. It's focused on student debt, which is not all we work on. We also work on issues of rent and tenancy, and also medical debt and school lunch debt, which is a big problem in the United States. Little kids who are in debt and so therefore don't get fed at school and are shamed for not being able to pay for their meals. But yeah, I'll if we could roll the video, that would be great. It's about 6 or 7 minutes, if I remember correctly. The American dream used to be owning your own home. Now it's being debt-free. Altogether, Americans owe a record-breaking $15 trillion and counting. Sold as a lifeline, debt is too often an anchor, dragging people down with compounding interest and fees, pulling wealth and resources from the working class to bloat Wall Street's bottom line. Every debt we hold is someone else's asset, with our monthly payments providing steady revenue streams for greedy creditors. Households with credit card debt pay around $1,155 a year in interest alone. Americans now die owing an average of $62,000, much of it credit card debt. A significant amount of the $770 billion of credit card debt sloshing around is medical bills, ambulance rides, doctor's visits, and surgeries paid for with the swipe of a little plastic card. Then there's the additional $140 billion of medical debt and collections, combined with an estimated $50 billion in back rent and $1.4 trillion in auto loans. Much of this debt didn't exist a few generations ago. Consider the $1.8 trillion in student loans this country now holds, which wasn't a problem in the 1960s when college was often free, or close to it. Ronald Reagan helped change that. He made his name by demonizing protesters on the University of Berkeley campus. In 1967, as governor of California, he pushed the university system to start charging students tuition so they would, quote, think twice about whether they wanted to pay to carry a picket sign. During his career as senator, Joe Biden advanced Reagan's project, working to expand student lending. As a senator from Delaware, the credit card industry capital, Biden was a devoted servant of the financial sector. He fought relentlessly for 2005 legislation that weakened borrower protections and made bankruptcy more difficult for regular borrowers, strengthening the hand of the student loan and credit card industries and helping cause a wave of home foreclosures. But debt is not just about money. It's about power. Debt has long been both a source of profit and a tool of social control and racial domination. The Founding Fathers knew this. Thomas Jefferson argued that debt should be canceled after natural limits, which he took to be about a generation, but only for white men like himself. In 1803, he wrote that debt should be used as a weapon against indigenous people to steal their territory. We shall be glad to see the good and influential individuals among them run in debt, because we observe that when these debts get beyond what the individuals can pay, they become willing to lop them off by a cession of lands. Sharecropping, redlining, predatory lending all continued this trend, deepening racial inequities. As a result of the 2008 mortgage crisis, Black and brown families lost upwards of 50% of their collective wealth. For regular debtors, even a late payment can spell disaster. A tanked credit score can make it impossible to rent an apartment or get a job. Default on your student loans? The government can seize your wages, tax refunds, and Social Security. Debtors' prisons are technically unconstitutional, but in practice, people struggling to pay medical bills or court fees can wind up in jail. But not all debtors are treated so cruelly. Rich people regularly walk away from their obligations, and companies engage in strategic defaults. The banks that crashed the economy in 2008, they got bailed out. Donald Trump, the self-professed king of debt, left a string of corporate bankruptcies in his wake. And don't forget that during the COVID pandemic, the federal government spent hundreds of billions of dollars buying up bad corporate debt belonging to entities including Exxon and Walmart, and offering companies, including payday lenders, forgivable loans. It's time regular debtors got a break, too. It's time for a jubilee, the erasure of debts and a rebalancing of power between regular people and elites. It's not a new idea. Jubilee was described in the Bible, and many ancient civilizations had periodic jubilees to avert social and economic collapse. Our earliest recorded histories are stone tablets inscribed with credit ledgers. Nearly as long as debt has existed, debt cancellation has existed too. Throughout history, debtors have risen up to demand relief. In the early 6th century BCE, a debtors' riot helped nudge ancient Athens towards democracy. The reforms, known as the shaking off of burdens, included debt absolution and an end to debt bondage. Something similar happened in ancient Rome after debtors mounted the world's first general strike. In the United States, indebted workers and farmers revolted in the colonial era, and then again during the Great Depression. Later, the call for debt cancellation rang out at Occupy Wall Street. In recent years, striking debtors helped force the government to cancel billions of dollars in student loans. Abolishing medical debt, back rent, and student loans would free up money now spent on debt servicing for other things. People could buy homes and start families, and the racial wealth gap would narrow. Research estimates that canceling student debt alone would boost the economy by up to $108 billion a year and create 1 million jobs. Under pressure from activists, President Biden campaigned on a promise to cancel an immediate minimum of $10,000 of student debt per borrower. Thanks to the Higher Education Act of 1965, he has the power to cancel all federal student loans. With a single signature on an executive order, President Biden can free people from student debt, giving tens of millions of people their lives and futures back. Now, we need to make him do it, and much more. We deserve nothing less than a jubilee. Thank you. All right, a little bit of an animation from a different era, organizing is hard work. We did build our movement again, starting in during Occupy Wall Street, which is 2011, and did push the President of the United States to promise mass student debt cancellation. It would have been around $500 billion if it had happened, which would have been actually the biggest wealth transfer from the government to working class people in history in one go. And it was blocked by the conservative Supreme Court. We did keep organizing, specifically with older debtors, who in the United States, older student debtors are the fastest growing demographic because so many people go back to school when they've been laid off late in life, or take out debt for their family members, or women lose their husbands, divorce, or being widowed and go back to school to try to skill up. So we won significant relief for older debtors and some changes to protect their Social Security from garnishment. But in the end, we did win about $175 billion, freeing around 5 million people from student debt, and more importantly, politicized this idea and got and put the flip side of the question on there, which is, it's not we aren't just organizing people for debt cancellation. We're trying to organize people so that we have the things that we need to live dignified lives. So one thing we like to say at the Debt Collective is, we're not living beyond our means. We're denied the means to live in a society where the minimum wage at the federal level is $7.25 an hour, and there are no public goods and services. Of course, people are going to go into debt, which means people are robbed twice: at the job by their boss who underpays them, and then by the creditors who take advantage of this relationship and lend money at interest. We built the power we built, and we are a very small, scrappy group, by building solidarity across difference. Today, we could imagine maybe that there is a movement of debtors or student debtors that would see themselves as having something in common. When we began organizing, that wasn't the case, right? There was no political consciousness, let alone solidarity. Why would someone who went to, I don't know, Miguel, for example, feel that they had any and had a student loan, feel they had anything in common with someone who went to a community college or Harvard or another institution? Solidarity is something that doesn't happen spontaneously. It has to be built through a level of analysis and recognition. So we had to bring people together so that they could see the analogies, the way that their stories resonated. We have kept going, and now we have brought other kinds of debtors into the fold. People who owe medical debt, people whose credit cards reflect the fact that they don't have public dental care. And so actually what looks like a credit card bill is in fact something essential, like getting a cavity filled, right? And so the solidarity is something that doesn't happen. It does not happen spontaneously. It has to be constructed across differences. And so solidarity is, the recognition that even if we're not the same, again, that looking sideways, that we have things in common, and that maybe we have a shared interest, a shared material interest in changing things. So I, have been thinking about debt for a while, but I took the opportunity of writing the Massey Lectures to kind of study the Canadian situation in more detail, and to think a bit about how some of those insights apply to Canada. And debt is also very much a crisis for people there. And I wrote a bit about farmers. And there are, I just want to draw out some of the history that was in the animation. So, debt is, why I'm interested in debt is because it's a power relation. And it can also be a form of power for the indebted if we again, organize ourselves. So I told the story of, just briefly, of Thomas Jefferson, a founding father, who wrote in very enlightened fashion about the fact that debt could be oppressive. He himself was a debtor who was constantly trying to figure out how to have some economic breathing room. And so he argued that debt should only last for what he thought was a generation, which is 19 years, and then people should be freed. He also thought laws should also have a kind of a date at which they expire, so that previous generations don't oppressively control future ones. So he had some interesting views. But when it came to, again, the dispossession of Indigenous people, he was mercenary. Let's use debt as a weapon. If you look at the history of the Hudson Bay Company in Canada, debt was absolutely a tool to dispossess Indigenous people, especially during the fur trade. So Indigenous fur traders were paid in beaver tokens, which are kind of company currency, just could not get out of debt. And so this is a dynamic that continued into the 20th century of communities being in hock to the company store, and this having ruinous consequences. And in fact, I sort of breezed through it in a paragraph in this book, but I think it's worth lingering on. The mortgage, as we know it, which is, of course, a debt instrument, but also an instrument of foreclosure, it changed form when it reached the colonial shores of North America. So in England, under English law, you could not take somebody's home if they did not pay their debts. You could, a creditor could say, we want the rents, we want the fruits, but the house was, the home itself, the land could not be taken from someone. And there were stories, for example, the creditor saying, well, I can't take your house, but I can move in. So it must have been very awkward, right? When you suddenly had the person who you owed money to moving back into the house with you. That changed when, that changed during colonization, when the mortgage became a tool to seize the property of indigenous people, right? And so what began as a tool of, again, of colonial world building is now then, and was targeted at indigenous people. This is now what we accept, what we think of as a mortgage, right? That if people, whether they're homeowners or farmers, cannot pay their debts, that they will lose their land. And I think that's an interesting historical example what if there had been solidarity, right? What if people had said, oh, this destructive arrangement might actually come for me, right? There might be that boomerang effect. So this history, I think, is really interesting. So debt, in Canada and the United States was really wielded as a weapon of power, of profit. So I think that's some of the interesting history that we're still living in the present day. Farmers have a really unique and powerful role to play in the history of debt resistance and debt relief. And that, again, was just mentioned very briefly in the animation. And it was something that even as I was making that animation, I didn't know fully. So there's a really rich, deep history of organizing by farmers through the colonial era into the early 20th century, where farmers were actually the ones who were leading the charge for debt relief and also for bankruptcy protections. So in the United States, there's actually bankruptcy protections in the Constitution, but those were written from the perspective of the creditor. And they are now interpreted in a completely different way, 180 degrees. And that is because farmers had a history of mobilization, of organizing, and of political engagement. And so it was farmers that really secured the right to get out of some kinds of consumer debt. And farmers, I know the United States history much better, but there were multiple federal bankruptcy laws that then would get attacked, taken away, under a sort of political reaction, and farmers would mobilize again and demand that they be able to keep their farms or have a chance of renegotiating their debts, or getting out from under their debts without losing everything. That community, however, sort of acted in isolation. There was never a movement across debt types or debtor types. And so when the economy sort of shifted away from, farming being a main social formation into more, people working day jobs, the relationship between debt and debt relief changed. Farmers were, again, very well organized, very powerful, very respected, and were able to lobby effectively for their rights and protections. When workers who often did not own property, obviously were not farmers, became more dominant, they didn't face the same threats, right? There was no farm to be foreclosed upon. Often they didn't even have much property. And they were less able to, they were organizing more as laborers, right, in labor unions, which is very important, but less as debtors. And that gave lenders the upper hand. And so lenders were able to strip not strip them, but to deny the same degree of protections. And it changed the way that debts are collected. So what was devised was the idea that, well, you're going to pay for decades into the future. Essentially, if you go into debt, you are going to have to agree to a contract, even if you are struggling and are going through some kind of bankruptcy, that means you are going to have to essentially mortgage your future to your creditors. So there's another example where, there was kind of different constituencies that lacked the solidarity that might have been able to build power and create a very different arrangement. So flash forward to today, and what I learned and what I wrote about in The Age of Insecurity is that many farmers are now, as they have been in ages past, they are burdened by debt that they cannot pay, and that many are ashamed of this fact and reluctant, at least according to the experts I spoke to and the stuff I read, just like people who are suffering from student loan debt or medical debt, are reluctant to talk about it, who feel that it is their fault. But according to some of the sources I read, Canadian farmers today collectively owe 129 billion, which is 4 times what was due in the 1990s. I'm sure that figure is out of date. And that Canadian farmers pay approximately as much in interest on these loans as they do, as they receive in federal subsidies. And this debt has specific consequences, right? It encourages some people to sell their lands, sell their property in order to get out of debt, which means then they're not passing it on to their children. Sometimes it prevents people from switching their farming practices, moving to other ways of conducting their business. I didn't write about this in the book, but I've done some research and interviews with farmers in the US who owe money to, it's not mortgage, but they owe money to large agribusiness. So for example, chicken farmers who are indebted to Tyson for machinery, and what they are essentially on a treadmill where they cannot stop essentially being indentured servants to big agriculture because they're trapped in debt and they cannot get out of this financial arrangement. So there are some groups that are trying actually to offer these farmers low interest loans to get out of these debt contracts, these predatory debt traps, so that they can then move to other types of farming. So here again, this constituency seems very different than the student debtors I'm working with, but what we're seeing is the same dynamics of high interest payments, extractive arrangements that limit people's choices, that curtail people's ability to make the choices that are best for them and the choices that are best for their community. So I draw the analogy between these farmers who want to change their farming practices to perhaps become more become organic, or I don't know, I'm not a farmer, so I'm making it up, to a student debtor in the United States who would love to go and be a public defender, working to provide legal services to, indigent clients, but he says, shit, I have $200,000, $300,000 of student loans. I'm going to go be a corporate lawyer instead. So that's how these debts impact the choices we make, and why I think it's so important that people organize. So on the organizing front, maybe I'll just say a few quick words about solidarity, and then we'll go into some Q&A. So I think, the first step towards building solidarity is to start talking about the situation we're in. You can imagine workers sharing a factory floor going, God, I can't actually pay my rent. I'm treated like crap by the boss. You start talking about it, then you start organizing. So at the Debt Collective, we host something called Debtors Assemblies, which are spaces where we invite people to talk honestly about their financial lives. And often it's the space that the first time people have been honest about what's going on. And that is I think the beginning of solidarity in our context. Solidarity, it turns out, as a word, it's a word in a practice that I think is under discussed. It is a word, obviously, it's a word that progressives often use, people on the left. I partly wrote a book about it because I think it's really important to build, and because I think solidarity is a precursor to democracy. In other words, solidarity is as important as equality, as freedom, as justice to the democratic project as those other concepts, but we don't recognize it as such. It's just kind of something we toss off. But if people aren't connected in solidarity, they don't fight for each other, they don't fight for a better world. Solidarity, the word, it turns out, actually goes back to debt. If you trace it back to ancient Roman law, it actually means a debt held in common, to be in debt together, to be on the hook together, which I like as a metaphor. It means that solidarity isn't just a fuzzy feeling, it's a material reality, that we're actually interdependent. And that's part of the power. There's material economic stakes to it. And actually, solidarity as an idea sort of came as a metaphor from that ancient Roman law into French legal code, into the Napoleonic legal code, and then political activists, socialists, organizers took that idea from the legal code as a kind of metaphor and thought, wow, this is a principle that is really essential. And so there was a movement in France in the late 1800s, early 1900s, of people obsessed with solidarity. They were called the solidarists, who were key in fighting for the beginning of the French welfare state, and actually the welfare state as we know it. And their argument was that we are all indebted, right? This idea of solidarity as a debt held in common. And this became the basis of their argument for the welfare state, that we're in debt, we need to pay our debts to one another by paying our taxes and building a state that works for everybody. So the history of solidarity, it turns out, as a concept, is there's like a very rich philosophical and political history that we don't know as much because we just think of it as a slogan, and that actually solidarity was a key concept in the development of the welfare state as we know it. And I think that, this is the final thought, is that solidarity is, I think, an idea that we should use to define the political horizon that we're working for, right? That we don't want to just build solidarity among people so that we can have the power in our unions to fight, but that we can also build social structures that encourage solidarity. So we talk in the book about the idea of a solidarity state, which would be a kind of improvement on the welfare state, a world that structures things like education, healthcare, and more to encourage a sense of solidarity and connection among its members. So that's an idea I wouldn't mind fleshing out if we want to talk more.
Excellent. Thank you, Astra. It was a pleasure to hear from you directly, commenting on some of the points in your book. And yes, we'll move to questions.